No one in the border village of HFY crossed the Black Ridge after dusk, because that was where the predator dragon lived, a massive slate-scaled terror known for crushing caravans, stripping herds bare, and leaving nothing behind but scorched stone and silence. Yet on the night everyone else barred their doors and whispered prayers. A small human child named Alara slipped away from her home clutching a strip of clean cloth and a wooden cup of water. Alara was barely 8 cycles old, thin as a reed, the kind of child people forgot to notice unless she spoke, and she rarely did, not since the raiders had taken her parents seasons ago, leaving her with a habit of listening instead of asking. She had seen the dragon earlier that day while gathering herbs near the ridge, seen it thrashing in pain rather than hunting, its enormous head lowered, one claw scraping uselessly at its own snout where a long iron thorn, likely from an ancient siege barrier, had embedded itself deep between the scales. The dragon's roars were not challenges but agony, shaking dust from the cliffs and sending wildlife fleeing in every direction. And while adults would later argue whether the beast deserved its pain, Alara had only understood one thing. It was hurting, and it could not help itself. By the time she reached the ridge, the moon had risen high and silvered the dragon's scales, revealing scars layered upon scars. The marks of a life spent fighting a world that answered its existence with fear and weapons. The dragon sensed her approach instantly, its massive body tensing, one eye snapping open with lethal focus, fire curling instinctively in its throat. Yet Alara did not run. She stopped at a distance, small hands shaking but steady enough to raise the cup of water. Her voice barely louder than the wind as she said the only words that came naturally to her. "I can help, if you let me." The dragon did not understand her language, but it understood intent, and something in the child's posture. No weapon, no dominance, no demand. Confused it enough to hesitate. Slowly, impossibly, the dragon lowered its head, hot breath washing over Alara like a furnace blast that should have sent her screaming. Yet she stood her ground, tears streaming from the heat and fear, stepping closer one careful pace at a time until she was close enough to see how the thorn had torn flesh beneath the armor of scales. Up close, the dragon was terrifying beyond legend, its eye larger than her entire torso, its jaws capable of ending her life with the smallest reflexive movement. And still Alara reached out, her fingers brushing the cool edge of the embedded iron. The dragon snarled in pain, muscles coiling, but did not strike, frozen by a sensation it had never experienced before: restraint. Alara worked slowly, whispering nonsense words meant more to soothe herself than the beast, wrapping the cloth around the thorn for grip and bracing her feet in the dirt as she pulled with everything her small body could muster. Pain roared through the dragon's nerves, fire spilling uncontrolled into the night sky. Yet it held still, because somewhere in its ancient, predatory mind, it understood that this fragile creature was choosing to suffer the danger rather than flee it. When the thorn finally came free with a wet, grinding sound, Alara stumbled backward and fell, clutching the bloodied iron as the dragon reared up with a deafening roar that echoed across the valley and sent the village into panic. Flames erupted, wings spread wide, and for one terrible moment the world seemed poised to confirm every fear ever whispered about dragons, until the beast lowered its head again, carefully, gently, and exhaled a stream of warm air not as fire but as heat, cauterizing its own wound under Alara's shocked gaze. She should have run then, every instinct screaming at her to flee. Yet she didn't, because the dragon did not advance, did not threaten, only watched her with an intensity that made her feel seen rather than hunted. Alara stood on shaking legs and did something no scholar, knight, or mage had ever done. She reached up and placed her small palm against the dragon's snout, right where the thorn had been. The contact sent a ripple through the dragon's massive frame, something old and buried stirring awake, an instinct not of dominance but of guardianship, forged long before wars taught dragons to be monsters. In that moment, a bond formed, not magical in the ritual sense, not spoken or sworn, but undeniable, etched into instinct and memory alike. Far below, the villagers would later swear they saw a shadow circle their homes that night, vast wings blotting out the stars. Yet no fire fell, no roar of hunger followed, only silence and the faint echo of something new being born in the dark. When Alara finally turned and walked home, exhausted and unaware of the future she had just rewritten, the predator dragon watched until she disappeared from sight, then lifted into the sky, not to hunt, but to patrol, its path tracing the boundaries of the child's world, because the creature that had once been a terror of the ridge had made a choice, and from that night onward, nothing that threatened the human child would survive long enough to regret it. By morning the village of Ashwell woke to a world subtly but irrevocably altered, though no one yet understood why, because nothing was burned, no livestock missing, no claw marks gouged into the earth as they usually were when the predator dragon passed nearby, only a strange stillness that sat heavy in the air like the pause after a held breath. Alara moved through the village as she always did, quiet and small, helping an old baker carry flour sacks, fetching water for a woman whose knees had given out, her hands still faintly smelling of iron and smoke though she scrubbed them raw at the well, and she did not speak of the night because she did not know it was something one was meant to explain. The first sign came when a band of ridge marauders crept down from the high paths at midday, emboldened by weeks of unchecked raids and confident that Ashwell's thin wooden palisade would fall as easily as the others had, their blades already wet with intent. The warning bell barely rang twice before a shadow passed over the ground, vast and sudden, blotting out the sun as the predator dragon descended from the clouds with a roar that split the sky itself. Villagers screamed and scattered, memories of firestorms and slaughter rising like ghosts. Yet the dragon did not strike the village. It struck outward. Flames carved a burning line between Ashwell and the marauders, not wild or indiscriminate, but precise, herding them back toward the cliffs as if an invisible boundary had been drawn. Those who tried to flee upward found their escape cut off by beating wings and collapsing stone, the dragon's presence overwhelming without ever touching the homes below, and within moments the raiders were gone. Some fleeing, some buried, none left to boast. Silence followed, thick and disbelieving, broken only when the dragon landed atop the ridge rather than within the village, curling its massive body protectively around the high ground like a living wall. Only then did Alara feel it. The low, steady pulse in her chest, not pain or fear, but recognition, as if something immense had turned its attention toward her and decided she mattered. The adults argued in frightened clusters, some insisting the dragon was merely guarding its territory, others whispering that the end times had finally chosen Ashwell. But the truth crept in slowly as days passed and patterns emerged. Predators stopped approaching the village perimeter. Storms split around the ridge instead of breaking over it. Travelers began arriving safely along roads once considered death paths, telling stories of a great slate dragon seen circling overhead, watching but never attacking, its gaze always drifting back toward the cluster of human homes like a sentry on endless watch. Inevitably, someone noticed where the dragon's patrols centered, and their eyes followed that invisible line until it pointed, unmistakably, to one small child. Fear curdled into suspicion. Questions sharpened into accusations. Some demanded Alara be sent away for her own safety. Others argued she was cursed, bait for destruction yet to come, and even those who had benefited from the dragon's protection found it easier to be grateful from a distance than to accept the cause living among them. Alara felt the shift keenly, though no one raised a hand against her. The way people's voices softened too much when they spoke to her. The way doors closed a little faster at night, and it hurt more than hunger ever had. On the fourth night, as the tension reached a breaking point, a hunting party from a rival settlement marched toward Ashwell under the false banner of aid, intending to seize supplies and test whether the dragon truly defended the village or merely passed overhead. They did not reach the gates. The dragon emerged from the darkness like a living storm, blocking the road with its body and lowering its head until its eyes burned level with the would-be invaders, issuing a warning roar so deep it rattled armor and bone alike. Yet even then it did not kill. It waited. When one of the hunters loosed an arrow in panic, the dragon reacted faster than thought, fire flashing. Not toward the village, not indiscriminately, but narrowly enough to melt weapons from hands without burning flesh, a display of restraint that left survivors fleeing in terror of a monster that could choose not to be one. That night, as the village gathered in shaken awe, Alara slipped away once more, drawn by the same quiet pull that had guided her before, climbing the ridge until she stood before the dragon in the moonlight. The wound on its snout had healed into a faint scar, and when it saw her, it lowered its head without hesitation, a gesture so deliberate it stole Alara's breath. She placed her hand where it had been before, and this time the dragon rumbled softly, a sound not of hunger or threat but something perilously close to contentment. In that moment, understanding bloomed, not as words but as instinct, that the dragon was not protecting the village because it was territory, but because it was hers, and by extension, everything that belonged to her mattered. Far below, the villagers watched a silhouette of impossible size bow its head to a child no taller than its claw, and something old and fearful cracked inside them. They began to realize that what stood guard over Asheville was not a force they could command or banish, but a bond they would have to learn to live beside, one forged not through conquest or magic, but through a single act of compassion that no prophecy had predicted. And as the dragon lifted its wings and resumed its silent patrol of the night sky, Elara walked home alone, unaware that by choosing to ease another's pain without expectation, she had rewritten the rules by which power itself responded to humanity. The third change did not come with fire or wings, but with people, because once fear gives way to curiosity, it rarely stays contained, and Asheville soon found itself the unwilling center of a spreading tide of attention that no palisade could hold back. Word traveled along trade routes and through whispered campfire stories that the predator dragon of the Black Ridge no longer hunted villages but guarded one, and that its allegiance, if such a word could be used, was tied not to kings or armies but to a quiet human child. Scholars arrived first, cautious and wide-eyed, carrying scrolls heavy with theory and light on lived experience, followed by mercenaries who pretended to be traders, priests who argued whether the bond was heresy or miracle, and envoys from lords who smiled too carefully when they looked at Elara, calculating how a dragon protector might be turned into a strategic asset. The village strained under the weight of their presence, markets swelling, tempers fraying, gratitude mixing uneasily with fear, because protection had a way of attracting the very dangers it promised to ward off. Elara sensed the tension even when no one spoke it aloud, felt the dragons circling grow tighter, more alert, its patience thinning as unfamiliar intent crept closer to the one it had chosen to guard. When the first attempt came to test the bond, it was cloaked in ceremony rather than force. A noble delegation arrived with gifts and proclamations, proposing to relocate Elara to a fortified keep for her safety. An offer that sounded kind until one listened carefully enough to hear the chains implied by concern. The village elders wavered, torn between fear of refusing powerful interests and the shame of surrendering a child who had done nothing but help, and Elara, small and steady, resolved the matter without raising her voice. She said no, not defiantly, not dramatically, but with the simple clarity of someone who knew where she belonged, and when the nobles pressed, the sky darkened as vast wings cut through the clouds, the dragon descending low enough that the air itself seemed to recoil. It did not roar. It did not burn. It merely stood between Elara and those who would take her, its presence an unspoken boundary that needed no explanation. The delegation left soon after, their gifts forgotten, their smiles gone. The lesson spread faster than rumor. The dragon responded not to titles or threats, but to the will of the child it guarded, and attempts to separate them would be met not with negotiation but finality. That realization hardened some hearts and cooled others, yet it also drew those who had been wronged by power rather than wielded it. Families displaced by war, outcasts marked by old feuds, travelers seeking a place where the strong did not automatically prey on the weak. Asheville grew, unevenly and imperfectly, becoming a refuge not by design but by consequence, and the villagers had to confront a difficult truth. Safety demanded responsibility, and compassionate scale required boundaries. Elara struggled most with this, because she had never wanted authority, only to stop someone from hurting, and now her presence shaped the fate of dozens. The dragon, sensing her unease, altered its behavior in subtle ways, intervening less visibly, driving threats away before they reached the valley, allowing the village to function without constant reminder of its protector's shadow. That restraint proved crucial when the inevitable challenge arrived not from raiders or nobles, but from a coalition of lords who could not tolerate an unclaimed power destabilizing their borders. They marched with banners and siege engines, framing their advance as a containment effort, confident that numbers and preparation would succeed where intimidation had failed. The dragon met them on the open plain beyond Asheville, far enough that no stray flame could touch the village, and the battle that followed became legend not for its destruction, but for its precision. The dragon did not raise armies or scorch fields. It dismantled capability, melting wheels, collapsing bridges, shattering supply lines, leaving the coalition stranded and humiliated rather than slaughtered. When one desperate commander attempted to bypass the dragon and rush the village directly, Elara stepped forward onto the ridge, visible to all, and raised her hand, not in command but in plea. The dragon halted mid-strike, fire dying in its throat, and the commander understood too late that the true power he faced was not the creature above, but the bond below. The coalition withdrew in disgrace, their authority diminished, their confidence broken, and the message carried on the wind was unmistakable. Domination would find no foothold here. In the aftermath, Ashwell stood at a crossroads, no longer able to pretend it was a forgotten place, forced to decide whether it would become a fortress, a sanctuary, or something harder and rarer, a community defined by choice rather than fear. Elara, sitting beside the dragon at dusk, her small form leaning against a warm, scaled flank, understood that the world would keep testing what it did not understand, and that her gentleness would be mistaken for weakness again and again. She also understood something deeper now, something the dragon had always known. That true guardianship was not about standing above others, but standing with them, and that as long as she remembered why she had reached for the thorn in the first place, no force born of cruelty would ever truly be able to cross the line they had drawn together. By the time the first winter after the dragon's choosing settled over Ashwell, the village had stopped being merely protected and had begun, quietly and imperfectly, to change, because safety altered behavior long before it altered belief. Children played farther from the gates, farmers planted fields they once feared losing, and arguments that might have ended in violence softened into words instead. Not because people had become better overnight, but because fear no longer dictated every decision. Elara grew in that space between watchful wings and human uncertainty, still small, still quiet, but no longer invisible, and she learned that being seen was heavier than being afraid had ever been. The dragon remained close yet unobtrusive, its patrols widening as threats diminished. Its presence felt more than displayed, a living reminder that power could choose restraint without ceasing to be power. When spring came, so did a different kind of visitor. Not soldiers or nobles, but emissaries bearing questions instead of demands, people who had heard enough to realize that whatever guarded Ashwell could not be bought or broken. They asked how the bond worked, what ritual had been used, what price had been paid, and Elara answered them all the same way. There had been no ritual, no bargain, no prophecy fulfilled, only a moment when hurting mattered more than fear. Many left disappointed because they wanted instructions, something repeatable, something that would let them manufacture loyalty the way they forged steel. And Ashwell learned then that not every lesson could be exported without losing its meaning. The hardest trial came not from outside, but within, when a harsh winter illness swept through the valley, taking the young and the old alike, and for the first time the dragon could not burn the problem away or frighten it back into the mountains. Elara sat beside the sick, holding hands, fetching water, doing the small, exhausting work that no legend ever bothered to record, and the dragon watched helplessly, restless and furious at an enemy it could not fight. When Elara herself fell ill, the village held its breath, because fear returned sharper than ever, and the dragon's anguish shook the ridge, its roars echoing for leagues as it paced powerless. She survived, not through miracle but care, through neighbors who stayed awake in shifts and herbs gathered from frozen ground. And when she woke, weak but alive, the dragon lowered its head and pressed it gently to the earth beside her. A gesture of relief so profound it left hardened villagers in tears. That moment, more than any battle, sealed what Ashwell had become, because it revealed the truth no one could deny anymore. The dragon was not the reason the village endured. It was part of how the village had learned to endure together. Years passed, slowly, as they should, and Elara grew taller, stronger, her voice surer, though she never lost the habit of listening first. The dragon aged too, scales bearing new marks, movements slowing just enough to remind everyone that even guardians were mortal in their own way. Ashwell did not become an empire or a holy site. It became something rarer, a place people spoke of with a kind of careful hope, where power had once been met with kindness and chosen to answer in kind. When Elara finally asked the dragon one evening why it had trusted her, why it had not burned her where she stood, the answer came not in words but in feeling, a shared memory of pain and restraint, of a world that had only ever taught it to strike first, and the shock of encountering something fragile that did not try to dominate or flee. Elara understood then that the bond had never been about her being special. but about her being ordinary in a way the world often punished, gentle, patient, willing to risk herself to ease another's suffering. As the dragon lifted into the twilight sky for another slow circuit of the valley, Elara watched it go without fear of abandonment, because she knew now that protection born of compassion did not vanish when out of sight. Long after songs exaggerated the tale and travelers argued over its truth, Ashwill remained, quietly defiant, a living answer to a violent world's favorite lie. The story was never that a child tamed a monster, but that a monster recognized a protector when it saw one, and chose, at last, to be the same.